the end of the 18th century, the increasing use of the cotton gin made cotton a more profitable crop. Production increased 400% in 5 years, and the demand for slaves to work in the cotton fields accelerated accordingly. The profitability of cotton and its adaptability to climate and soil conditions across the South encouraged planters to move westward, spreading cotton and slavery to Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and eventually the eastern half of Texas. As Northerners advanced westward, their economy and their society grew more diversified. But in the South, westward expansion had a very different character. Between 1795 and 1860, more than 800,000 slaves were transported into western cotton states. Planters increasingly grew cotton in place of food crops. Industrialization was discouraged. Even railroad routes were selected primarily to facilitate the shipment of cotton rather than to promote trade and transportation. As the North diversified economically and socially, the South continued to narrow its options, and the peculiar institution of slavery came to define the Southern way of life.
Slavery was a very powerful institution in the South, culturally, socially, intellectually. Planters dominated the Old South, and their power rested on the institution of slavery.
It's in the plantation setting that slavery can be most fully exploited. It's in those areas that we see slavery become much more ingrained as an economic institution. And it's with both the economic expansion of slavery and the political and philosophical argument defending that institution that we see the two sections that would become the North and the South moving apart.
Of course, slavery didn't affect just Southerners. Economically, the nation benefited. Northern merchants, northern insurers, northern shippers profited from the exportation of cotton to New England and to England and France and Belgium. By 1840, 20 years before the Civil War, 60% of American exports, not Southern exports, but American exports, were cotton, produced mainly by slaves.
Slaveholders held sway in Southern politics, but they could maintain control only as long as they convinced non-slaveholding whites of their common cause.
Racism was used aggressively to divide poorer white Southerners from slaves. The relationship between the wealthy and the poor was something that was really aggressively exploited, I think, by slaveholders to ensure that poorer white Southerners felt that they had a similar cause.
Only about 25% of white households owned a slave, so 75% did not. They didn't own slaves, but they could dream of owning slaves. And if they could dream of owning slaves, they could dream of leaving the fields themselves and allowing slaves to do the farm labor that they and their children did, and withdraw to the veranda perhaps, and even drink mint juleps along with those rich neighbors down the way. But more important, I think, was the psychological satisfaction of being a white person in the South. The fact was that all white men, whether clean and classy or tobacco-stained and ignorant, sat in the social structure at a step or two steps above the most educated, the most refined, the most humane of black people.
In order to quiet the consciences of white Southerners and provide a convincing rationale for the growing system of slavery, slaveholders in the 19th century needed a new definition of slavery. Once considered a necessary evil, slavery was now proclaimed a positive good.
The Negro slaves of the South are the happiest and, in some sense, the freest people in the world. Free laborers have not a thousandth part of the rights and liberties of Negro slaves.
Slavery, Southerners insisted, did a great service to blacks, lifting them out of their natural barbaric states and exposing them to the values of Christian civilization.
That property is in our hands, I believe, by the will of Providence, and the fact of possessing them is justified by the example and language of patriarchs, prophets, and apostles from the day of Abraham to the period of St. John's Revelation.
And as abolitionist attacks in the North grew louder, Southern society closed its ears, outlawing even the publication or discussion of anti-slavery opinions in its midst.
My God has no law. Look down, that long, long road where you...
Slavery is not one thing, but slavery is many things. And when we know somebody is a slave, we know something very, very important about that man and woman, but we don't know everything. Their lives are very, very different depending upon the kind of work they do and the kind of circumstances they live in.
Slaves worked as laborers on small farms, servants in urban households, as factory workers, riverboat men, carpenters, blacksmiths, prostitutes, and at many other occupations. More than half of all slaves lived on plantations or agricultural estates with 20 or more slaves on them.
People who worked in the field were due in the field 30 minutes before sunrise. Women did every job that men did except jobs that required animals. So if a field had to be plowed with an ox, that was a man's job. If the ditches had to be cleaned, if the canals had to be cleaned, if trees were cut down, if wood was sawn, all of these jobs were also women's jobs. Children's jobs on this plantation included going into a 98-acre field and picking the bugs off of all of the crops. Women and men who worked in the house typically thought of themselves as having a better job, in part because they were associated with the owner's family. They heard things people who worked in the fields didn't hear. So their exposure was different, but God knows their work cycle was not. They worked 7 days a week instead of 6 days a week, as field hands did.
Every night, the servant comes in and gets my boots and cleans them. Every morning, he comes in before I'm up, brings me water to wash, brushes my clothes, and builds a fire when one is necessary.
At night, when I am down to prayers, the chambermaid comes in and turns down the bedclothes and puts things in order for me to go to bed. In fine, everything is done for me. I have nothing to do, and I find it really convenient to be waited upon.
Slavery gave whites control over the lives of blacks, control over their physical bodies, and to some extent over their minds. But as in any human relationship, there was always an element of negotiation involved.
I think that the whip and overt force is successful only up to a point. Owners are trying to get from the slaves as much work as they can for as long a period as possible, and slaves are trying to get, as you know, the human instinct to work as little as possible for as much as they can get in terms of reward. For example, allowing slaves a certain amount of time after they completed their work to plant a small area of land for themselves. At minimum, it would be the area around their cottage. The lands were not used only for economic exploitation, but they're also used as special areas of rest and recuperation, and may have been used in some areas to bury family members. We get a sense of a relationship between slaves and land, which was very similar to the relationship between Africans and land.
Within the confines of slavery, blacks created a world of their own where whites could not enter. Slave culture consisted of religion, folk tales, music, and dance. It was a shared experience that gave pleasure, hope, and meaning to difficult lives. and it was a subtle form of defiance.
My old missus promised me Shoo-a-la day. When she died, she set me free. Shoo-a-la day. She lived so long her head get bald. Shoo-a-la day. She give up the idea of dying at all. Shoo-a-la day.
Slavery is always two great stories. One of those is the story of imposition and violence, hideous and obscene violence which is rained upon people who are subordinate and don't have much means to protect themselves. But the other part of slavery's story is, of course, that slaves themselves refuse to give in to the violence, refuse to be dehumanized by dehumanizing treatment. And on very narrow ground, almost from the beginning, begin to create a way of life which sustains them in meaningful ways.
They created families, they created community, they created folk culture, they created African-American Christianity in the quarters. They resisted the enslavement that white people thought was natural to them. They knew that slavery was unjust, and they fought to keep from internalizing that perspective of themselves.
You just took and jammed yourself on that there tar baby without waiting for any invite, says Brer Fox, says he. And there you is, and there you'll stay, 'cause I'm gonna barbecue you this day, sure, says Brer Fox, says he.
Slaves' stories were intended to teach as well as to simply entertain, and they taught lessons, particularly to children.
I don't care what you do with me, Brer Fox, says Brer Rabbit, says he. So you don't fling me in that there briar patch, says he.
Children had to learn to be slaves, and every parent wants to protect their children, from the harshness of this world. And slave parents had a particularly difficult task ahead of them. How do you survive the institution of slavery?
'Cause Brer Fox wanna hurt Brer Rabbit bad as he can, so he caught him by the behind legs and slung him right in the middle of that there briar patch.
You had to be shrewd. You had to be clever. You had to outthink the master, because the master was always stronger.
Bread and bone in a briar patch, Brer Fox, says Brer Rabbit, says he. Bread and bone in a briar patch. And with that, he skip out this as lively as a cricket in the embers.
Slave culture gave slaves a life beyond the drudgery of work and a means of resisting the dehumanization of slavery. Whippings and beatings were common methods of punishing slaves for everything from theft to insolence. The only terror greater than whipping for a slave was to be sold away from his home and loved ones.
Other than the land that a planter owned, the most valuable property he owned would have been a member of the slave community. Collateral on loans. If you didn't want a loan, you just needed money, you simply sold somebody. The African-American family doing slavery was as important as family is to any people, whether enslaved or free. Sometimes we attribute characteristics to individuals who may be enslaved that are subhuman or less than human characteristics that we attribute to everybody else. Within every society, the family is probably the most important institution, and it would have been within the slave community here.
In Africa, what many believe to be nothing more than decoration turns out to be a form of encoding. Well, that tradition of a visual language was brought here, and the quilt was going to be the primary means through which it would be continued.
It has long been believed that the designs in slave quilts were a means of transmitting information to help runaway slaves. A recent book describes a visual code of slave quilts as it was explained to the authors by Ozella Nathaniel Williams, a descendant of slaves.
The wagon wheel was an indication to pack away, as Ozella told us, food In other words, be prepared for a long journey.
Quilts were hung out in the open for all to see, yet only slaves recognized their significance.
My favorite is bear's paw because it indicated you followed the footprints of the bear, the real footprints of the bear. They will lead you to food, to water, and if you're fortunate enough, you will be able to use their den as a place of shelter. The final quilt was the tumbling blocks. Because of the shape of the boxes, one would realize it was time to leave, to pack them up and go, or to box them up and go, as Ozella said.
There was a wide range of reasons for slaves running away. Some were personal, some were family, some were difficulties with overseers, some were difficulties with owners, some feared that a child or a loved one would be sold. Some just the thought of freedom kept ringing in their ears and their minds, and they couldn't remain enslaved. One example was a 9-year-old boy named Nathan, who was a slave in Tennessee, who ran away at age 9, ran away again, and ran away again. And the woman that owned him was going to send him to a man who had great experience in reasoning with slaves about recalcitrant, quote, unquote, action. Nathan arrived and within a week ran away. The man went out and took 3 days, found him, brought him back, discussed the matter. Nathan promised that that would be the last time he ran away. 2 weeks later, Nathan ran away again. The man brought him back, and this time connected punishment with the discussion about you shouldn't run away. The 4th time Nathan ran away from the man who was supposed to cure him of running away, he was put in chains with an iron collar around his neck and sent back to the woman that owned him.
A runaway slave faced many obstacles, especially in the Deep South. Slave patrols, slave catchers, and white vigilantes made escape dangerous and success unlikely.
The vast majority of slaves who ran away were striking out for areas right around the plantation or to see loved ones on a neighboring plantation. Some were moving to the south rather than to the north, or to the east and to the west, looking for loved ones, looking for kin.
The severest punishments were often reserved for the runaway slave, who spread discontent and a desire for freedom in the slave quarters.
Slaves were brought back in and whipped in front of everybody and in front of their own families. And sometimes women were whipped in front of their families too. And it was a painful experience for the blacks in the community to watch this. An example is in Montgomery County, Tennessee. The slave Dave, they whipped him from his heels to his shoulders, and they put salt in the wounds. And then they whipped him more and put salt in the wounds a second time. And they put him in a little shack. They had chains on his legs, fearing he would run away. And after 10 days, with 2 slaves guarding this shack, he somehow worked out of the irons and escaped into the night, and he was never heard from again.
Recent historical analysis has suggested that the number of runaways was far greater than previously thought.
It was a rare planter who could say, none of my slaves ever ran away. If even half of them had 1 runaway each year, and 1 out of 7 of the other slaveholders had 1 runaway a year, there would have been 50,000 slaves that ran away a year. We think that's a very conservative estimate.
Slaves who ran away risked a great deal in their search for freedom, but those who attempted outright rebellion risked almost certain death.
Slaves were outnumbered 2 to 1 by white people. Not only outnumbered, of course, but outgunned 100 to 1. So from the beginning, slaves were in a very disadvantaged position, and the likelihood of a successful slave rebellion was slimmer in the American South than anywhere else in the New World.
Despite the overwhelming odds, in 1831, the slave owner's worst nightmare came true. a slave named Nat Turner led a rebellion that rampaged through Southampton County, Virginia for 2 days before whites managed to put it down.
I heard a loud noise in the heavens, and the Spirit instantly appeared to me and said the serpent was loosened. I should arise and prepare myself and slay my enemies with their own weapons.
Nat is a complicated figure, literate, somewhat a charismatic figure, this Methodist exhorter, someone who studied the Bible, someone who believed in portents, believed that he was a prophet, that his responsibility was to lead this attack.
With a small group of co-conspirators, Nat Turner's rebellion began with the killing of his own master and mistress.
Armed with a hatchet, I entered my master's chamber. It being dark, I could not give a death blow. The hatchet glanced off his head. He sprang from the bed and called his wife. It was his last word.
From there, the slaves moved on to neighboring plantations, killing men, women, and children, and gathering new slaves and weapons at each stop. By the time the rebellion was put down, some 60 white people were dead. But that number paled in comparison to the number of blacks murdered by whites in the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion.
I think there was always this fear of mass slave rebellion. And we see this in the way that slaveholders react to any suggestion of slave insurrection. They react mercilessly.
The news of that rebellion spread throughout the South, and legislatures from Louisiana to Virginia harshened already harsh slave laws. They cracked down on slaves and on free blacks throughout the South.
Because Nat Turner was a literate Christian, a member of the church, a preacher, rules were changed about black worship, about slave worship. It forced the white communities to dust off rules and regulations about slave literacy. And we find that white society comes down very hard on slaves being able to read.
Perhaps the most profound way in which Nat Turner's rebellion affects American life is the way, of course, that news of that rebellion moves through the slave quarter, and how Nat becomes an extraordinary figure within slave life, a figure of a person who does what perhaps many people would like to see done, and becomes a kind of Promethean figure.
Nat Turner's rebellion struck a chord that reverberated throughout the South and the North, terrifying white Southerners and emboldening black and white abolitionists of the North. Perhaps most importantly, it gave slaves a hero to call their own.
There is a school of thought that suggests that Africans became slaves, that somehow there was a race created, a race of slaves, and in their hearts, the fire of freedom did not burn very, very brightly. And slave owners would say, well, the slaves were happy, that they were happy-go-lucky because we took care of them. They didn't worry about too much. Nat is the lie to that. Nat says no.
Slavery defined the South. As both blacks and whites adapted to conform to its pervasive demands, their characters were often transformed by corruption and degradation. Blacks struggled valiantly to maintain a sense of self-worth through slave culture and community. And whites created a powerful system of denial to shield themselves from the unacceptable truth that slavery was a moral wrong. Though the Civil War would bring an end to slavery in the United States, its effects lasted for generations afterward, and some would say have still not entirely faded away.
The stain of slavery in white eyes continued well after the death of slavery itself. There was a presumption of superiority on the part of most whites, and the presumption of inferiority of blacks.
What it means to be as an American, it means to subscribe to the Declaration of Independence. That's the way we measure our success as a nation. We have tried now for, well, almost 150 years to somehow address the kinds of inequality that slavery created.
I think it is probably that we have not had an open enough dialogue to move beyond what history created.
In Black American culture, the history of slavery is still a little painful, so it's not embraced. There is a tendency to skip some 200 and odd years of history because it's a history of slavery.
Perhaps understanding slavery better and understanding its complexities, its diversity, and the resistance that was offered will help us better cope with what's coming in the future.
We're learning that slaves were able to carve out a niche, a social and economic niche for themselves, wherein there was strong family development, strong cultural development, and that kind of evidence feeds back now, I think, on contemporary Black community to help us to better understand that long road that's been traveled since leaving Africa. So slavery it's changing.
Once 3,000 descendants of a slave community appear on the grounds that their ancestors walked upon, you never again think of that historic site as a white-only historic site. It is always, it's etched in your vision, in your mind. The most vivid memory I have is an elderly Black man walking through the planter's house and looking around, and he said, "You know, we did some fine work, didn't we?" Priceless.